Engineer humiliates black bricklayer without realizing he would fire him in front of everyone. What happens when arrogance meets hidden power? Can you please be quiet and let the professionals speak? Richard's voice cut through the air like a razor, instantly silencing the makeshift meeting room on the construction site. We don't pay bricklayers to think, just to follow instructions. Andre Jefferson felt the heat rising in his neck as dozens of eyes turned to him. At 42, with 2 decades of experience in construction, he had never been humiliated so publicly. His only crime had been to point out a critical flaw in the foundation design that could compromise the entire 30-story corporate building. "With all due respect, sir," Andre replied with surprising calm. "The slope of this land will cause uneven pressure on the northeast foundations. The calculations don't take into account the calculations," Richard interrupted with an exaggerated laugh, turning to face the team of engineers and managers. "Listen up, everyone. The bricklayer now understands structural calculations. Maybe we should give him his diploma since he clearly knows more than someone with a master's degree from Stanford." Nervous laughter echoed around the room. Andre kept his gaze steady, breathing deeply to control the anger boiling inside him. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but public humiliation hurt in a different way. Richard Harrington was the new chief engineer at Horizon Constructions, hired just 3 months ago and already known for his explosive temper and arrogance. His impeccable blazer and Italian shoes contrasted with the simple clothes and calloused hands of the workers he supervised with constant disdain. "If you want to keep your job on this project," Richard continued, approaching Andre with a cold smile, "I suggest you stick to mixing cement and leave the important decisions to those who studied for it." The silence was palpable. Some workers looked down at the floor, embarrassed. Others, mainly the other white engineers, smiled discreetly, as if approving of the putting of the bricklayer in his place. What no one in that room noticed was the calm in Andre's eyes. It was not the resignation of someone accepting humiliation, but the tranquility of someone watching a predator walking straight into a trap. How will Andre turn the tables on his arrogant boss? Stay tuned to Black Voices to find out. "Understood, sir," Andre replied simply, gathering his notes. "I just thought I should mention it." Richard smiled victoriously. "Now that we've resolved this hierarchy issue, can we continue? We have a tight schedule." The meeting proceeded with Richard dominating the conversation, pointing to charts and schedules on his tablet as he explained changes to the project that would save time and money. No one noticed Andre discreetly typing a message on his old cell phone. At the end of the meeting, the workers began to disperse when a notification sounded on Richard's cell phone. The engineer frowned as he read the message, his face visibly paling. "Emergency meeting with the owner in 15 minutes, he announced in a tense voice. "It looks like Thomas Jefferson is coming to personally assess the progress of the work." A murmur ran through the group. Thomas Jefferson was the reclusive owner of Horizon Constructions, rarely seen on construction sites. His presence meant something extremely important or extremely problematic. Richard nervously adjusted his tie as he tried to project confidence. "Get everything ready. I want this place spotless." As everyone rushed about, no one noticed the discreet smile on Andre's face. No one noticed when he left the room and walked calmly to the administrative trailer. No one imagined that behind that simple construction worker's uniform lay a story that was about to turn that construction site and Richard Harrington's life upside down. If this story of prejudice disguised as professionalism has touched your indignation, subscribe to Black Voices to find out how Andre would turn public humiliation into a powerful lesson about never judging a book by its cover, especially when the book you judge may be your boss. 15 minutes turned into an hour of tense waiting in the administrative trailer. Richard paced back and forth, nervously checking his watch while the other engineers tried to look busy reviewing blueprints and checking schedules they already knew by heart. No one mentioned the elephant in the room. Thomas Jefferson, the mysterious owner of Horizon Constructions, never made unscheduled visits, and when he did visit, he rarely brought good news. Is he coming because of the budget cuts I approved? Richard whispered to his assistant. I explained that we saved almost $1 million on foundation materials. I don't know, sir. The message just said he needed to evaluate the project personally, replied the assistant, equally nervous. Outside, Andre Jefferson slipped out to his car, a modest sedan parked far from the executive area. He opened the trunk and changed his work shirt for a clean, well-ironed dress shirt. Then, he took out an elegant leather briefcase and a pair of thin-rimmed glasses. He's here, someone shouted, and everyone rushed to the entrance of the construction site when a shiny black Mercedes pulled up. Richard straightened his tie and was the first to approach, a rehearsed smile on his face, his hand outstretched. Mr. Jefferson, what an honor! We are perfectly on schedule. And the driver's door opened first, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, clearly a security guard. From the rear door emerged a middle-aged black man wearing an impeccable suit, his serious face marked by lines of experience. Richard froze, his welcoming expression turning to confusion. I'm sorry. We're expecting Mr. Thomas Jefferson. The man in the suit extended his hand. Thomas Andre Jefferson, owner of Horizon Constructions. The shock on the faces of everyone present would have been comical if it weren't so revealing. Richard blinked several times, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But Richard stammered, unable to complete the sentence. The owner of the company? Yes, Thomas replied with almost surgical calm. And also the bricklayer you humiliated in front of the entire crew a few hours ago. A deathly silence fell over the construction site. Richard turned completely pale, his face now whiter than the plaster on the partially erected walls behind him. Mr. Jefferson, one of the other engineers, stepped forward. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Mr. Harrington didn't know I was the owner, Thomas/Andre finished. That's exactly the point. Nobody knew because I didn't want them to know. Thomas looked around at the workers who were now gathering at a distance, watching the scene with growing curiosity. 15 years ago, I founded Horizon Constructions with the promise of revolutionizing the way we build, Thomas continued. But I noticed that over time, we began to lose touch with what happens on the construction site. So, with every new major project, I spend the first few weeks working incognito. I trade my suit for a mason's uniform and my last name for my middle name. Richard looked like he was about to faint. Mr. Jefferson, I had no idea. If I had known, that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Thomas interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. If you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect. But because you thought I was just a black construction worker, you felt entitled to humiliate me in public. An older man with dark skin and gray hair stepped forward. He was Walter Green, the master builder who had overseen the project for decades. Mr. T, he said familiarly, "You could have warned me. You were doing your special inspection again." Thomas smiled for the first time. "And miss a chance to see how things really work? Walter, you know that defeats the purpose." Walter nodded, turning to Richard with an expression that mixed disappointment and something close to satisfaction. "I've known Thomas for 30 years. We worked together as bricklayers before he started the company. He always says that a building is only as strong as its weakest foundation, and a company is only as honest as its most arrogant employee," Thomas added, adjusting the glasses he was now wearing, a subtle but effective transformation of his persona as a bricklayer. Meanwhile, several workers who had witnessed Thomas's humiliation earlier couldn't hide their smiles. Some whispered among themselves, others just watched with an expression that clearly said, "Now things are going to get interesting." Richard attempted a desperate recovery. "Mr. Jefferson, if you'll give me the opportunity to explain my vision for this project." "Your vision?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The same vision that completely ignored a warning about structural flaws in the Northeast foundations? The same vision that prioritized cost-cutting over safety?" He motioned to Walter, who stepped forward with a folder. "I've already asked Walter to review in detail the concerns I raised this morning. We've discovered that the foundations are already showing microcracks exactly where I indicated." Thomas turned to the group of engineers. "I want a full meeting in 15 minutes in the main trailer. Bring all the blueprints, cost spreadsheets, and technical decisions made in the last 3 months." As the group quickly dispersed, Thomas took a step toward Richard, lowering his voice so that only he could hear. "You know what's most ironic, Mr. Harrington? If you had simply listened to the bricklayer, you would have impressed the owner of the company with your humility and collaboration." Instead, Thomas left the sentence hanging, adjusting the wristwatch that had been hidden under the sleeves of his work shirt. Richard stood motionless like a plaster statue. As Thomas walked away toward the administrative trailer, several company executives now rushing to follow him, in the eyes of the arrogant engineer, there was no longer disdain or superiority, only the pure terror of someone who realizes he has built his own downfall on foundations of prejudice and arrogance. And as the afternoon sun began its descent on the horizon, casting long shadows across the construction site, a truth emerged clearer than the fresh concrete. The humiliation Richard had planted that morning was sprouting rapidly, growing into an imposing structure that would soon crush him completely, and the sentence was still being built, one block of consequences at a time. In the main trailer of Horizon Constructions, the silence was absolute. On one side, Richard Harrington and his pale team; on the other, Thomas Jefferson, now in a business suit, accompanied by Walter and 2 technical auditors. "Let's get right to the point," Thomas began calmly. "Why were my observations about the foundations not only ignored, but ridiculed?" Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Jefferson, there was a misunderstanding. I was just reinforcing the hierarchy," Thomas interrupted, grabbing his tablet. "Our manual clearly states, any employee, regardless of position or function, has a duty to report possible structural flaws." Thomas slid his finger across the screen, and our cameras capture audio. With a tap, Richard's arrogant voice filled the trailer. "Here we work with calculations, not with the eye of a bricklayer who doesn't even know how to hold a tape measure properly." Richard loosened his tie, suffocated by his own recorded arrogance. "In the last 2 hours," Thomas continued, projecting documents onto the wall, "we've reviewed all of your engineering decisions." An auditor stood up. We found 17 safety violations. The most serious one is about the Northeast foundations. We also identified unauthorized material substitutions and falsification of test reports. Richard turned pale. I can explain, an engineer on the team couldn't take the pressure. Mr. Jefferson, several of us warned Mr. Harrington about these problems. He insisted that the calculations were correct and that the savings were necessary too. For what? Thomas asked. For the end of project bonus, another engineer confessed. If we saved over $1 million, we'd all get a substantial bonus. Richard stood up abruptly. This is a conspiracy. I'm a respected professional with a master's degree from Stanford. I'm not going to let a bunch of what? Thomas asked sharply. Bricklayers, black people, finish your thought. The silence was deafening. Richard collapsed into his chair, defeated. Thomas motioned to Walter, who handed him a folder. Richard opened it with trembling hands. It was his termination letter. Am I being fired? He asked incredulously. I have two options for you, Thomas replied. Top 1, termination for cause with civil proceedings for negligence and falsification. Your license will be revoked. Richard swallowed hard. Option 2, voluntary departure. In exchange, you will return all bonuses and work 6 months as a volunteer in the training program for young people from disadvantaged communities. 5 minutes to decide. In the meantime, let's gather everyone outside. I think they deserve an explanation. In the central courtyard, the workers gathered curiously. Thomas climbed onto a platform. Good morning. For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Andre Jefferson, founder of Horizon. Some of you know me as Andre, the novice bricklayer. Surprised looks and smiles of understanding appeared among the workers. I'm here for 2 reasons. First, to announce that Richard Harrington is no longer part of Horizon. A stunned silence followed by spontaneous applause, which Thomas silenced with a gesture. The second reason is more important. At Horizon, we don't just build buildings, we build mutual respect. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or learned on the streets, your knowledge is valuable, your voice deserves to be heard. The trailer door opened and Richard came out carrying his belongings. His gait was defeated, his shoulders slumped. As he passed through the crowd, he faced a corridor of stairs, not mocking, but something perhaps more painful, pure pity. Thomas watched as Richard reached his car. Before getting in, his eyes met Thomas's, a brief nod of recognition, not of true regret, but of someone who finally understood the gulf between authority and respect. Walter approached him. Which option did ye choose? Thomas smiled slightly. Surprisingly, voluntary training, there's hope, even for the most difficult cases. Walter shook his head. You've always seen beyond appearances, that's why you built this company from the ground up. Thomas gazed at the construction site where workers were returning to their posts with renewed energy. True architecture isn't just about putting up walls, Walter, it's about tearing down the invisible barriers that prevent talented people from being heard. On the horizon, the building structures rose against the sky, not just concrete and steel, but a monument to the idea that respect is not imposed by title, but earned through the humility of recognizing that wisdom can come from the calloused hands of those who know every grain of sand that supports the foundations, not only of buildings, but of human dignity. 6 months had passed since the day Richard Harrington was fired. In front of the entire construction site, the Horizon Constructions Tower now stood imposingly against the city skyline, its foundations reinforced exactly where Thomas had warned of problems. On the 30th floor, in a conference room with a panoramic view, Thomas Jefferson chaired the quarterly meeting with his executive team. Walter, now promoted to Director of Operations, presented the impressive results of the Talent Integration Program, an initiative that identified promising workers at all levels of the hierarchy and offered mentoring and training. Our safety ratings have improved 78% since implementing the new open communication protocol, Walter explained, projecting graphs onto the screen. When any employee, regardless of position, can report concerns without fear of retaliation, we identify problems before they become crises. Thomas nodded, satisfied. The public humiliation he had suffered as Andre the bricklayer had turned into the biggest revolution in Horizon's corporate culture. The model was being studied and replicated by construction companies across the country. What about our volunteer program? Thomas asked, already knowing the answer. Walter smiled, moving on to the next slide. In the photo, a group of young people from disadvantaged communities were receiving professional training in construction. Among the instructors, surprisingly, was Richard Harrington, thinner, unshaven, but with a different look in his eyes. The program has already trained 52 young people with an employability rate of 94%, Walter replied, and as for our most unusual instructor, I must admit that he exceeded my expectations. After the meeting, Thomas went down to the training center located on the ground floor of the building. There he found Richard, now without his expensive suit, teaching structural calculations to a diverse group of students. The former chief engineer looked up when Thomas entered, and something indecipherable passed between them, not friendship, but a reluctant respect. Later, in the parking lot, Thomas found Richard packing materials into his car, no longer the luxurious convertible, but a compact, practical model. Mr. Jefferson, Richard greeted him formally. How are you adjusting? Thomas asked. Richard hesitated. I thought it would be punishment, 6 months teaching calculus to people who barely finished high school. He glanced at the building, but I've discovered something unexpected. They learn fast, they ask questions you'd never consider, they see solutions that aren't in the books. It's amazing what we discover when we stop judging by appearances, isn't it? Thomas observed gently. Richard studied the floor. I learned that lesson on my first day. I could have ended my sentence right there. It wasn't about punishment, Thomas clarified, it was about transformation, for you and for them. In 2 weeks, my term of service ends, Richard said. I already have a few job offers. Thomas nodded. And which one will you take? Richard looked at the training center. Actually, I've asked permission to continue as a volunteer instructor for another semester. I have some promising students I don't want to abandon in the middle of the process. A discreet smile appeared on Thomas's face. Approved. As Thomas returned to his office, he reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought him there. From humiliated bricklayer to respected property owner, he had built more than buildings. He had built a legacy of dignity and respect that transcended titles and prejudices. On the wall of Horizon's main lobby, a golden plaque displayed the company's new motto, inspired by that fateful confrontation: we build structures with materials, but we build respect with humility. Engineering had taught Richard that every structure, no matter how imposing, begins with a solid foundation. Life had taught him that the same principle applies to human character. The humiliation he had inflicted on a mere bricklayer had destroyed his career, but from the ruin, something more valuable was born: the understanding that true knowledge does not come from diplomas hanging on the wall, but from the ability to recognize value where others see only difference. As for Thomas, his revenge was not to destroy the man who had humiliated him, but to transform him into someone better, proving that true leadership is not imposed by authority, but earned by example. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on how we judge others by appearances, subscribe to Black Voices for more powerful narratives that reveal uncomfortable truths about our society and show that true victory is not in defeating our enemies, but in turning antagonists into allies and building a world where respect is the most solid foundation there is.